Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers Podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I'm joined by an esteemed group of educators, Dylan Wiliam, Chris Harrison, and Joe Boaler. Our conversation centers on exploring the life, work, and lasting pedagogical legacy of Paul Black. If you've spent any time thinking about formative assessment, you've likely been influenced by Paul Black, perhaps without even realizing it. Paul Black passed away in March of 2026 at the age of 96. He originally trained as a physicist with a PhD in crystallography from Cambridge before shifting to a focus on how students learn. He co-authored Inside the Black Box in 1998 with Dylan Wiliam, which argued that reform should focus on internal classroom mechanics rather than just inputs and outputs. This work popularized the idea of assessment for learning, which champions using assessments as diagnostic tools to help students improve, rather than just for grading and ranking. Some of the key classroom innovations include comment-only marking or providing descriptive feedback without grades to focus on growth, increased wait time, encouraging a 3 to 5 second pause after questions to allow for processing, peer and self-assessment, and enabling students to take ownership of their learning through rubrics, and formative testing where tests are treated more as learning events. Paul's work fundamentally reshaped national curricula and teaching standards globally, and in this discussion, we try to bridge the gap between Paul's roots in physics and crystallography and his transformative transition into education research, and why so many current assessment models still miss the mark by prioritizing efficiency over the messy human work of learning. We also explore why true formative assessment isn't just about giving feedback. It's also about things like dialogue and moving students towards self-regulation. And we touched on the tensions around efficiency, especially in mathematics education, and how to balance the need for standardized scores with the development of curiosity and metacognitive skills. Paul Black's lasting impact on teaching and learning is profound, and despite not being a household name in many education circles, something to be admired and appreciated. By all accounts, his intellectual humility was one of his most endearing traits, and as you'll hear Dylan say, something that we could certainly use more of in today's education dialogue and debate. Thanks to Dylan for his help in assembling this panel, and I hope my facilitation did Paul and his work justice. Just a reminder that you can find our professional learning work, blog posts, and podcast episodes at wegrowteachers.com. Please reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org if you have questions or comments. Now, here's our conversation. All right, I am with Dylan Wiliam, Joe Boaler, and Chris Harrison. We were hoped to be joined by Mark Wilson, but he is unable to be here. And this is a little bit of a different kind of episode from the usual podcast that we do, insofar as we're going to talk about the life and work of Paul Black and the connections to the guests that we have here today to that work. And insofar, like I said, as this is a little bit different, we're going to talk about his work, but also probably try to apply it to some of the present day kinds of discussions and where education is. We'll start with giving opportunities for the three esteemed guests to talk a little bit about, introduce themselves and talk a little bit about some of the connections to Paul, and then kind of go a little bit deeper in those connections, and then probably wrap up in a conversation that is a little bit more connected to the current day status of where we are with education and some of those discussions. But I'll stop talking because the guests here have lots more important and interesting things to say. Why don't we start with Dylan? You've been on the podcast before, and honestly, I was somewhat ignorant of Paul's work, and so far as I just knew his name from mentions, probably mostly from you. But it's an interesting, sort of paradox in that he obviously has had a profound effect on education and the way we think about assessment. So I'll leave it at that and give you an opportunity to kind of talk about your connection and if anything that you feel is important here.
Thanks, Drew. So I'm not sure when I first met Paul, but I think it must have been sometime around the fall of 1984, because I joined Chelsea College, as it then was, which had a kind of overfilled campus. So the main campus was in King's Road, but there was there was an outpost where a number of projects were located. One of them was the one I worked with, graded assessment, and the other was the assessment of performance unit in science. And Paul, I think, was the chair of that group, and so he was often in the building. So I think that's probably when I first met him. And he also chaired the interview panel that offered me my first tenure track appointment, if you like, my first permanent job in 1986. We worked together on and off. I then became Dean of the School of Education and assistant principal of the college. And I left King's in 2003 to move to the US, but we carried on working together. And our last collaborative paper was published in 2018. So we carried on working from those very early days right through till 2018.
Okay. And just if I will have said it probably in the introduction and the recording, but of course, Paul passed away earlier this year in 2026. And I had seen a piece that in some posts Dylan had made about his work, and obviously an important figure in his life, and thought it might be useful to have a conversation about that work and Paul. And so when I approached Dylan, I asked if he'd be interested, and then he said, well, let's extend that conversation to include a few other voices. And we've got a couple of those voices here. One of those is Chris. Chris, you are in London, and kind of introduce yourself, as folks may not be familiar with who you are and your connection and the work of Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I work at King's now and have worked there for a long time. But my first connection with Paul was that he was my PhD supervisor. So I was at the time looking at teachers' assessment practices in science classrooms for my PhD. And it was at the time when Paul and Dylan were doing the work that they did on the review on formative assessment. So there's a lot of connections between what they were doing and what I was seeing within the classroom. After that, they invited me onto working with them on a project where we took the ideas from the review and had a look at what teachers were doing in 2 areas in England. And that then has led on to more and more projects. I have to point out at this time that Paul was actually retired from King's. All of this happened after he'd done other things. So he'd been a scientist, he'd been a crystallographer, and he'd done a lot of work within physics, and he'd done a lot of work at King's within science education and some on assessment. And then all of this that we're talking about now, the assessment for learning that he's known so well for, came after he'd retired. So, he's had many careers going through, and I was fortunate enough to be in that retirement part with him. So I got the project money in and he did the work with me on the project. So I was very lucky to do 19 projects with him after he retired. And whereas Dylan knows a lot about the things that Paul was doing research-wise, I know the sort of work, how Paul's work actually played out within classrooms here in the UK, but also in many other countries as well. So we had 2 big European Union projects. So I come from the sort of more practiced, how does the research function within practice ideas? And that continued really up until about 3 or 4 years ago, when Paul finally had to admit that he couldn't keep doing this at the rate that he'd been doing all the way through his life, but particularly since his retirement.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he was 96 years old at his passing?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a pretty good run, right?
Pretty good run, yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think think is interesting in my world. We have our website, which talks about our work, which we have a lot of blog pieces, and one of them is about the difference between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. We probably need to update that with some references to Paul's work, but it is one of the most viewed pieces on our site for whatever reason. Let's go now to Joe. Joe is in Northern California, so some folks may be familiar with you and your work, but tell us a little bit about what you do and your connections to Paul.
Thanks, Drew. Yes, I teach at Stanford and have been at Stanford since the late 90s. But just prior to that, my biggest connection with Paul was, like Chris, he was my PhD advisor. And I really live with the advice Paul gave me. It shaped a lot of what I do. People may have seen our website, which is called UCubed, which shares an approach to maths to be more open and develop students through growth messages. And of course, assessment is critical to that. But during my PhD, what I wanted to mention was I was studying schools that were teaching differently, and I was in the schools for 3 years. So they were really deep, mainly qualitative studies. And Paul was so respectful of the need for that qualitative data. This goes against what a lot of educational research is now, which is experimental studies that look for one single factor and manipulate that factor. He knew, as I did, that schools are very complex environments. And if you really want to know the effect of a change in teaching approach, you really need to know the processes that are happening in the classroom. So I was collecting this qualitative data, and I still remember Paul talking about the need for triangulation and getting different forms of data, which I did, and asking me, what would it take to think the opposite of what we're thinking from the data? What would it take to shift that perspective? And so these were really kind of profound ways of thinking. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention that stayed with me is Paul told me my very first submission to a journal. He said to me, whenever you submit a paper to a journal, think about the next journal you're going to submit to when it's rejected. And that has been really great advice over the years. If you're an academic, you just have to get used to so much rejection. And I think helping people as they begin their career really be comfortable with that was so important.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Dylan, I'm going to ask you because, as I mentioned, we had hoped Mark Wilson, one of your suggestions, would be able to join us, and he's unfortunately unable to. If you can kind of unpack why you thought he would be a good addition to this conversation, maybe some of his connections to Paul and his work, and then maybe that might be a segue into to talking a bit more about Paul's work and the sort of we've touched on some of the broad strokes, but he went from one project to another project, these sort of almost orthogonal in some ways kinds of things throughout his life and his career. So if you don't mind kind of taking us on that journey for a bit.
So I think the points you made earlier, Drew, are quite important. The extraordinary thing about Paul's work is the number of different fields that he contributed to as an equal. And so you've heard Joe and Chris talk about his work in classroom formative assessment. He also was very, very skilled at policy advice. And his work with Mark, the reason I suggested Mark was because Mark has been doing some very kind of sophisticated psychometrics, using item response models, rash modeling, and other kinds of item response models to look at progression data for students with a view to helping students understand where they are in their learning and to help teachers in their work. So it's really just an extraordinary range of practices that Paul has been kind of master on. I remember him saying to me, the joke about teachers was they were a jack of all trades and a master of none. Well, he pointed out to be a good teacher, you have to be a master of all trades. I went back through my own notes and I found that my first paper of Paul's was about physics examinations in secondary schools, published in 1963. And so he was always interested in schools. He worked with John Ogborn on revisions to the Nuffield physics curriculum, which many people still regard as one of the best physics curricula of all time. It's just extraordinarily insightful work on how best to teach students advanced physics at the high school level. And so he was working on that. He had a kind of reputation, but it was a real shock, I think, to many when he was appointed to be the director of the Center for Science Education at Chelsea College, as it then was. Kevin Keohane had set it up, and it was assumed that the job would go to somebody who'd already been involved in science education. And people who didn't know about Paul's work said, well, this guy's a crystallographer. I mean, he's a hard physicist. And I think what they underestimated was his ability to just understand things that were beyond his direct experience. And I think everybody who's worked with Paul has just been so amazed by his ability to make sense of classrooms in particular. Paul has never taught in a secondary school or an elementary school classroom, but he still seemed to have an intuitive feel for that. And also just an incredible respect for the work of practitioners. Because he was so skilled at the policy advice, he was asked by Kenneth Baker, then Secretary of State for Education in the United Kingdom, actually England, to chair the task group on assessment and testing in 1987. And the idea was that they would advise the government ministers about how the national curriculum should be assessed. They'd already decided that there would be assessments at age 7, 11, 14, and 16. But they wanted to know what kinds of assessments would be involved. And I think the government ministers at the time were thinking about a kind of A, B, C, D, E grading system. And the work that Margaret Brown and I had done on graded assessment showed us that if you use that system, just a letter grade at each age point, the students who are getting D's and E's at the age of 7 were probably also going to get D's and E's at the age of 11, 14, and 16. And we were very much aware of Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset. And so Margaret Brown, who was a member of this, who gave advice to this committee, she persuaded the group that some kind of progressive scale would be needed. And he chaired this group that proposed a system of 10 levels, later reduced to 8 because they stopped it at age 14, where every student would be on the same scale and every student would experience progression. And the extraordinary thing about this was that although it was deeply unpopular at the time, and lots of people saw problems with it, it was subject of several governmental reviews, but it lasted 20 years. So basically, Paul's skillful chairing and getting that through the ministerial approval process basically influenced how students were assessed for summative purposes for a total of 20 years. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement, particularly given how much education ministers in England like to interfere with things. And yet his insights, his ability to articulate the policy issues clearly and to anticipate them, I think was an extraordinary contribution that really, as I acknowledged in one of the pieces I wrote about his work, he always kept the learners at the heart of the process. He always had a real insight into what will this feel like to teachers and particularly students in the classroom.
So I'm curious so you mentioned the pushback, and you said it was, I think your words were deeply unpopular. What were the reasons and the things that were driving that unpopularity?
One of it was subject or discipline based. So the idea of having 10 different levels of achievement was, I think, acceptable to maths and science teachers. The idea that you could identify 10 different levels of achievement kind of made sense. But language arts teachers in particular, history teachers, they just didn't like the idea of making so many fine distinctions. Now, because this was an age-independent scale within a particular group, for example, 14-year-olds, you would be typically only grading students from a level 3 to a level 7. So that was, I think, something that people hadn't appreciated. But the other thing was that it also depended heavily on the model of progression. So in science and in mathematics, progression really involves attending school and acquiring ideas. And so you can have 7-year-olds in science and mathematics whose work is indistinguishable from a slow achieving 14-year-old. They can actually move very quickly through the content. For language arts, it's not quite the same, because a mature 7-year-old doesn't do the same kind of language arts work as a low achieving 14-year-old. So I think that for language arts teachers, progression or what makes somebody good at something is much more tied to age for certain subjects than it is for mathematics and science. So that was, I think, a cause of some of the concerns. And the other idea was people completely misunderstood the model. They thought that you were saying that students moved in lockstep, when in fact he made clear that they didn't. The idea was you would start where the students are and give them advice about how to move on, going back to David Ausubel's idea of find out where their learners are and teach accordingly. So that was, I think, a source of misunderstanding. A lot of the criticisms were, I think, based on a misunderstanding of what was really being said.
Imagine that, people misunderstanding and misinterpreting people's words and things like that. Joe, Chris, feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts that you'd like to add. One of the things that people may or may not be aware of is that you and Paul collaborated on the book Inside the Black Box. And I'm curious how you might characterize, his sort of meticulous, sort of coming from, sort of physics background, and your ability or your work in, classroom level kinds of frameworks. How did that sort of mind meld go in terms of, informing one another, but also perhaps, having a bit of cognitive dissonance there?
I don't think there was any, simply because by the time we started working together, he'd already been chairing the assessment of performance unit work on science. And I never got the sense that he didn't understand what was going on in classrooms. So it was just, he was an amazingly quick study. He had a feeling for what was happening in classrooms, respectful of the content and the rigor, sure, but also understanding what teachers could do and what students could be reasonably expected to handle. So I think the biggest problem was we often came at things in very different ways from a very similar platform. So often I would write something and he'd come back with something that I had no idea what he was trying to say. And so we thrashed it through. And I think that's one of the secrets of the success of the work, is that we both knocked off the idiosyncrasies of the other person's work. And perhaps the best demonstration of that is our last piece of work together. So we wrote a chapter called Developing a Theory of Formative Assessment. And then we had Developing the Theory of Formative Assessment. And we weren't happy with all those, even though they were published. And we had a paper called FAT3, Formative Assessment number 3. And we literally batted that backwards and forwards for 7 years, from 2011 to 2018. And just basically trying to figure out what we wanted to say, trying to make sense of what the other person was trying to say. And eventually we decided we weren't going to make it any better. So we sent it off to a journal and it was published. And as I said, he was 90 years old when that was published, but his insights into the process were just as great as ever. So really no tension. The biggest issue was trying to research in a field where there's just no theorization. And so often people describe the review of research that Paul and I did as a meta-analysis, which is a dead giveaway that they hadn't read the paper, because one section of the paper was called No Meta-Analysis. We actually stated why it was inappropriate to do meta-analysis in such a poorly theorized field. In the end, and this was, I think, mostly Paul's doing, we searched by hand every issue of 76 different research journals over a 10-year period, because that was the only way we could figure out what the field was really all about. You couldn't use keywords, you couldn't use computer searches, you just had to get down to the library and read through those journal articles. And I think that was Paul's drive. The other major insight, you mentioned Inside the Black Box, the group that commissioned the research, the Assessment Reform Group, wanted the review of research. They weren't interested in disseminating it more widely. But Paul thought this really needs to have a wider audience. So the Assessment Reform Group actually said, yeah, if you want to do that, that's fine, but that's not part of the contract. So we wrote this booklet, and basically went beyond the evidence given, drawing on our experience of working with teachers and students, and published this booklet, which had a huge impact. And we produced a version for the US audience because Paul and I, and later Chris, were working with people at Stanford on science education research projects with Mike Atkin and Rich Shavelson. And so that led to the American version in Phi Delta Kappan. But it was interesting that the academics who commissioned our research weren't that interested in making this available to practitioners. They thought that was the final word. And it was just characteristic of Paul to say, no, this needs to be impacting classrooms, and we can't expect teachers to read a 70-page journal article. We have to write something different.
All right. So I think you've talked about, you mentioned the mistaken, accusation or whatever you might call it of being meta-analyses. But I think the word, as I was doing some research and work to prepare for this conversation, a configurative review, and if that's accurate, can you kind of talk a bit about what because that's not a term I'd heard of before. So configurative review and why that's different and how that's different and why it's important that it's different from a meta-analysis.
Well, we should say that we didn't call it a configurative review. We only discovered that that's what it was when David Goff, my colleague at the Institute of Education, used that term to describe different kinds of research reviews. And so what some people try to do is say, what's the average effect size of this intervention? So you make sure you include all the studies, and the big idea is you produce some precision estimates around the size of the effect. What we actually said was, no, we can't do that yet. What we can do is put some shape on the field. So the idea of just sorting out what the important ideas are, showing how it related to Benjamin Bloom's ideas about mastery learning, which nobody had mentioned before. The extraordinary thing about our review, Terry Crooks and Gary Natriello had written reviews of research in 87 and 88, looking at the impact of classroom assessment on student achievement. And Gary Natriello's review had about 90 studies. Terry Crooks had 240 something studies. They only had about 7 or 8 references in common. And neither of them cited a paper by Lynn and Douglas Fuchs, which was about formative evaluation in special education. So we saw our job as really pulling together all the sources, just saying what the big ideas were so that people could actually build future foundations. So configurative review is just giving shape to the field rather than trying to come up with definitive findings.
All right. And again, Joe and Chris, please chime in if you feel there are comments that you'd like to make. I think one of the last things, and I think you were referring to it, if I'm doing the math right, and Joe, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the 2018 sort of update to Inside the Black Box, is that the publication that you were referring to as you were talking about some of the later work you did with Paul?
No, it's Inside the Black Box was 1998. We launched it with the academic journal article, but got a lot of newspaper coverage. We worked quite hard on that. And then Chris and I and Paul and a couple of others worked on Working Inside the Black Box, which was the result of the research project that Chris worked on. So Chris was a kind of no-brainer when Paul and I were saying, who should we have in this project? Chris was our first choice. And then we actually managed to get some funding for an external researcher. So we then wrote that up again. We wrote some academic articles. We wrote a book called Assessment for Learning, Putting It into Practice, but we also produced a booklet. And a lot of people do this now, but at the time it was quite rare to think that part of an academic's job is to put this information in the hands of busy teachers who aren't going to read academic journal articles, and they don't have the time to read a book. So let's give them a 28-page booklet that they can actually look through quite quickly. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I think the important thing is, in terms of the way Paul worked, is he was interested in what teachers did with it. So he wasn't just interested in sort of reading research articles and coming up with ideas. He liked that part and was excited by it. But he was actually really curious about what it meant to teachers and the way that teachers conceptualized their practice. and the beliefs that they had as to what might work and what might not work. And I mean, I always remember when our teachers on that very first project suddenly said to us, I think they said it to you, Dylan, so you don't really know what it is we're supposed to be doing. You want us to work it out. And you know, we all said yes. And they didn't believe that. They thought any minute now we would stop telling them about the research and the ideas we got from research and say, so this is what you need to do as a teacher. We wanted the teachers to do that. And I think that has been a really important part of all of this work, that we've worked really collaboratively with teachers, believing that if we help them make sense of the research ideas, they will see what they can take from it and use in their classrooms. But the payback for that is that they then tell us about it so that we can make sense of what they're doing, because that then informs us for our research. And it's this interconnection of the research and the practice that has been really important. And, you know, it just all the while indicates the trust and the respect that Paul has for classroom teachers.
Yeah,
I've sometimes joked that the teachers thought we were offering a perverted model of discovery learning where we knew the answer, but we wanted them to discover it for themselves. And after a few months, as Chris said, they figured out we weren't going to give them any answers because we didn't know. We thought these ideas were important. The research says they were promising, but we had no idea what these would look like in the classroom. And so this point that Chris made, the research was genuinely innovative in that we worked with teachers. We asked each teacher, which class would you like to try this out with? What measures of achievement are you going to collect for your own purposes? What comparable classes are there in your school that we can use to see whether there's an effect? And so this was actually teachers and researchers working together to try to come up with something rather than researchers imposing a model on teachers. I think it was years ahead of its time. I think that's where educational research needs to go now. You know, the answer to improving classrooms isn't going to come from academics. It's going to come from teachers figuring out what some of these ideas look like in their own practice.
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, in our work and doing professional development, trying to bridge that gap, and how do we help teachers better understand the research, but actually consider it in a way that helps them, I think somebody said, make sense or make meaning of it, and really put it into practice, right? And that's such a challenge, because I think, as you mentioned, they're not going to read, you know, academic journals. They're not reading big books. They don't have the time. Maybe they don't have the motivation. There's perhaps a number of reasons that some might deserve some remedy, but how we get that into their practice for them to have reflective conversations and then grow from there. Dylan, you mentioned Carol Dweck and the growth mindset. And Joe, I'm curious how you think about your work with Paul and in this context of this conversation with, you know, sort of that growth mindset movement in math and your work.
Yeah, and just to follow on with these ideas about translating research into practice, this is really why we made our UCubed website, and we went a step further to say, what if we take these research ideas and build them into lessons and give those lessons to teachers and have teachers try the lessons? And that's really been the wild success of our website, is teachers actually trying these lessons and seeing what happens when maths is different. So I started at first, we started UCubed to share mindset ideas. A lot of maths teachers believe that kids can do it or they can't. But we very quickly realized that assessment is really key to mindset, that it's very hard to develop a growth mindset if assessment is always just short, closed questions that often in maths classrooms are also taken at speed. So Dylan's ideas, really, we integrated those into everything we were doing in our maths website. I did find when I first came to the US and I was sharing assessment for learning that teachers had heard of it, but it was being delivered in the US with real misunderstandings of what it was. And Paul, one of the things I got from Paul is he was always very conscious and purposeful about teachers understanding the meaning of this change, and how when students are brought into the assessment process, they change because they take responsibility for their own learning, and how, you know, this core piece of assessment for learning is the assessment informs student learning wasn't in the movements in the US. So I have to say it's hard to shift assessment in the US, especially in maths classrooms. And a lot of teachers get the need for a different assessment practices, but I think they just feel powerless with all of the pressures coming down from publishers and district tests. So it's always been a bit of a battle to get the ideas into practice here, but it's very critical to students developing a growth mindset.
I think part of the problem, though, Joe, is that most people, or most of the when these things get recommended by important bodies in various countries, so here in England it would be the Education Endowment Fund people would be recommending things, and they did a big thing about how great assessment for learning was because it provides feedback, so they focused it just on feedback. And it's not just feedback, it's a bigger thing than that. It's the interactions and the diagnosis of those interactions. It's focusing on the dialogue, and I know you know this, and the activities and so on that's important. Getting the questions right, just changing the questions. You know, I mean, I remember when I was a science teacher, I would just sort of get out a boring old practice off the windowsill and say, how is this adapted? But when I worked with the teachers on that first project, when the teacher said, okay, so plants need light for photosynthesis. So why don't the biggest plants grow in the desert, and plonk the cactus down? Complete change in the way that lesson ran. Because the kids were coming up with ideas going, yeah, of course it needs light to grow. Oh, hang on. So it's not adapted for taking the light, it's adapted for something else. What must it be? And eventually they got around, and it was their ideas they were focusing on, and not just worrying about the scientific fact that the leaves have been reduced through evolution to lose less water, and now they're spines. It wasn't that the teacher focused on. He wanted to know their ideas, not just the science facts. And it's that change really in how the interactions and the activities work together, so that what comes to the surface are the children's ideas that you can then sift the evidence from for where is learning now, and then decide what's coming next. And then part of doing that, children are getting feedback from that. But then if they haven't quite got it, or need them to know more, you give direct feedback. And it's that whole process. And too often it's focused on just one bit of that. And yet within this idea of assessment for learning, it's getting from where it starts through the formative bit through to the actual learning that teachers need to work on, which is why it takes quite a while to really embed for most teachers, so it's work at an optimal level.
I think there's another important point there, that in our work, the work was done both in Paul and my review, and then the work on the first project with teachers from Kent and from Oxfordshire, was that students had to be at the heart of the process. We discovered you can't change what teachers are doing unless you also change the role of learners in the classroom. And so we call this formative assessment, but other people called it assessment for learning for reasons that we needn't go into. But they defined assessment for learning almost exclusively in terms of the teacher's role.
Yep.
And then they had to invent this thing called assessment as learning because they realized they'd forgotten about the learners. Whereas for us, I think the big idea was that formative assessment was always primarily driven by a need for students to become self-regulating learners. Most feedback works towards its own redundancy because it helps learners take more charge of their own learning. So the aim of feedback is not to improve the work, it's to improve the learner. And I think that was something that Paul brought very early on into the project. And so in our earliest thinking, the role of the students was always key. Whereas, as Joe said, too often in America, Formative assessment means students getting a common task every 6 to 10 weeks and teachers looking at spreadsheets of student data and figuring out, what does this mean we need to do differently? The idea that students should be agents of their own learning is really very rarely present in American thinking about formative assessment.
And the students get feedback from the activities working as well. It's not always just from the teacher; they're getting it from their peers, and from how they think about things differently as they're going through. You know, how do I think about it now to how did I think about it 2 weeks ago? That's the difference, really.
So I'm going to try to connect a few things. I've been making notes as you all have been talking, and hopefully this is not too clumsy. But you know, you're talking about assessment for learning, and one of the things as you all were talking, I was thinking about the importance of that for students, and I'm curious where, if there was a genesis of the work with Paul that moved from teacher to student, or if they were both sort of simultaneously developing, you know, in tandem. In our work, you know, we do a lot of project-based learning work, and in our project-based learning model, we talk about meaningful assessment, not just assessment, but meaningful, trying to make it meaningful, which highlights, I think, some of those things about, are we collecting data, or are we trying to use that for learning, whether you're teaching, you're the teacher or the learner. And we also want to develop autonomy, but of course there's a level of guidance that needs to be happening there, which is the perennial argument, the ongoing argument that I have about inquiry versus, you know, something like explicit instruction. It's really about the level of guidance, right? And so, you know, I'm thinking about this in terms of how we sort of get to a better place with the sort of traditional assessment practices of whether it's here in the States and No Child Left Behind, and you know, state testing and standardized testing, of which there's some value certainly, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. How do we get to something that's a bit more useful and is actually more assessment for learning and more practical? And as you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind is a question about efficiency, which is almost always something that a lot of cognitive science of learning people will raise is a matter of efficiency. But Chris, as you were talking, I'm imagining some of those people might be hearing you talk and saying, well, but that's just not very efficient, right? You're asking them to think about it and then recursively think about it and then consider some other questions and some other data and some other information and phenomena, and then think about it again. So how do you think about that sort of issue and maybe tension with efficiency?
I think I don't, because I think about it in terms of learning. And I know myself that I think differently about some things in science or maths or whatever subject differently as I learn more. So how I think now, going back to say adaptation, but realizing how adaptation fits with evolution, I understand quite differently now to say how I did when I first came across it, either as a student myself or as a teacher trying to get students to understand it. And it's not something you pick up by going stepwise. It's something that you start to see things differently as your theories build. All the time you're going back and trying to test out yourself to really see whether you do truly understand that, or can you, there's some bits of science that I still can teach, but only because I actually know the main steps we're going within it. I'm not quite sure I actually understand it. But other things I feel I do understand, I'm learning more. And we want to get that idea really over to students, that it's not this easy stepwise learning of facts that you then just step up from one to another, but you have to keep revisiting things and doing it again. So for me, it's a sort of assessment that fits more with how I understand learning, rather than worrying about it from an efficiency point of view. I think the efficiency is that once kids have picked something up and start to play with it, then you already have got them involved, and the efficiency comes in that they pick things up better, quicker, later. And so the efficiency comes as you move through and they've got better grounding, because that's what you've really been working on to get them to that point. What's consolidated? What's the new learning? Do you know what that is? How does that add on to what you've already got? So they are actually involved in that, rather than you telling somebody, you now understand this. They can tell me they understand it and why.
And that ties into the work that Paul did with Mark Wilson on progression.
Yeah.
So there are basically two models of progression that are commonly used. One is progression as harder, and one is progression as better. So maths and science typically use the progression is harder. You keep asking more and more difficult questions until students get them wrong. English language arts tends to actually have a model of progression as better. So the idea is that you get more and more sophisticated responses. Certainly true in history. Not just, the cause of the First World War, not just the Archduke's assassination, but also militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and so on. So you see this kind of progression as better. And so the way I like to describe it, it's the high jump versus the ski jump. So with a high jump, it's how high is the bar you manage to clear. So you keep on making the task more difficult until the student fails. And the ski jump is everybody gets the same jump, but it's how well you do it. But there's a third model, I think, that formative assessment plays a role in, developed by Aisha Ahmed and Alistair Pollard at Cambridge University, which is progression as more independent. So they call it the support model. The idea is we actually don't just give students harder and harder tasks until they fail. We give them harder and harder tasks and give them more support so they succeed. And with the progression as better, we guide them in the way that they produce more sophisticated responses so that students' experience of assessment is a positive one rather than a blank page or just getting everything wrong. And I think that all these issues come together. And one of the things that came up very clearly very early on was that often teachers couldn't give feedback to students because they didn't know what comes next. They didn't have good models of progression. That's why I think Paul's work with Mark Wilson is so important. Once you know what comes next, giving feedback is easy. The struggle is often, I don't know what to say to this student next because I don't know what the models of progression are.
I really connect with those different models because, as you say, in maths, it's always just been about harder. And I teach undergrads at Stanford who every year come to my class, which is called How to Learn Maths, having achieved very, very high levels and telling me they don't understand anything they have done. It's really very sad to meet all of these students who have taken AP, BC calculus, and they're just filled with anxiety because they know they didn't really understand it. They went through all these hoops. So how do getting that shift? So maths teachers are more like language arts teachers and recognize that there's more to learning than going higher is so needed.
I remember having the same experience when I taught undergraduate mathematics majors at University College London. And so I just was teaching them about, math education and assessment. And so I asked these people, given the range of mathematical expertise in the population from 0 to 100, where do you think you would come? And these people had got the highest grades at A-level, the school leaving examination in England, and going to one of the most selective universities in the country. They thought they were probably about average. Because they're, in mathematics, we so many of our students think that they're failures, even when they're extraordinarily successful, because of the way that we present these ideas. So, for me, this idea of how learners make sense of their experiences is crucial, because if you don't feel you're successful, you're unlikely to invest the effort, and that's why all these issues, I think, interact. The idea that students get the sense that they can be successful at mathematics is a huge game changer. And I think Paul understood that better than anybody, just that idea of how do students make sense of their classroom experiences? How do they make sense of a success and failure?
Actually, it's interesting that one of the reasons, what the story Paul always used to tell was one of the reasons why he moved from being in physics to moving into education was because it was the work he did with the undergrads, both when he was working at Cambridge doing his own PhD and postgrad studies, and when he moved to Birmingham, where he was a physics lecturer. And it was, working with them and realizing that they were struggling, or that they couldn't always do the work, that's led him to move more into this sort of area. So, it's come all the way through, both within science and mathematics, I think within other subject areas as well.
And it also, I think, gives the lie to this idea that some people are so smart they can't get down to the level of a learner. I think the people who are really on top of the field have no difficulty explaining it in an honest way at any level of sophistication. I think Paul could do that. He could actually understand where learners were coming from. And as Chris says, his experiences of teaching undergraduates, I think, just kindle this immense curiosity about, what's going on in learners' heads, how can we find that out, and how can we react appropriately?
One of the things that I have been sort of exploring, and I'm reading a book that I actually, full disclosure, helped to give some feedback on, by Christian Moore Anderson, talking about teaching meaning, and he's really making the point there that there's a value to sort of transmitting and sharing expertise as teachers should and do, but that the only way that one can make meaning is inside one's own head, right? It can't be transmitted. And one of the things that he really emphasizes there, which I found to be interesting as I was thinking and saw a video of Paul talking, a very short video that I shared on social media about the importance of dialogue. And really the ways in which, I guess, maybe put another ways, the limits of, the kinds of quizzes and tests, like giving answers, of which there's certainly some value, but I would argue is overemphasized by at least a certain segment of the sort of cognitive science world, and in favor and the importance of having dialogue, which isn't necessarily always a conversation one-on-one. There's different ways that making that thinking visible so that you can get what's in students' heads out so that you can then react to it and do something with it. But of course, it comes back to that sort of efficiency kind of piece. How do you have dialogue and get what's in students' heads out in a way that is manageable and scalable? Because that's one of the sort of pieces of cognitive dissonance that sort of traditional testing tries to solve for, right? So I'm curious, how Paul thought about those kinds of tensions.
I think he was more interested in, from the work I did with him, he was more interested in what teachers did with it and how they actually managed to create those opportunities in the classroom. Because he realized that it was what was needed was some way of trying to get that discussion going so the ideas could come out from the students, but that many teachers didn't know how to approach that or felt they hadn't got the time. I mean, time was always there as something that haven't got time to this, haven't got time to that, love to do your work, but haven't got time to do it. So when he saw, when in the first project, he saw some of the teachers using concept cartoons, which comes from Keogh and Naylor's group in Manchester, whereas they just get a screenshot on a PowerPoint where it shows maybe 3 students responding to a problem, and then there's another student with a question mark in the speech bubble, and it's how teachers use that he was interested in. So I mean, the first one I think I worked with him on was with the snowman, where do you put the coat on the snowman or not? As you want to keep your snowman for as many days as you can, and 3 students putting their ideas forward about, this will make him melt more because he'll get warm. Another one was saying, oh no, it'll, what it means is the snowman will last longer, and so on. But it's how the teachers used it, and the teachers who used it where they said things like, so which of these other students' ideas are the best ideas? We're not thinking in a way that actually offered the opportunity for the new student idea to come out. Whereas if you just say, so what's your idea, or what do you think about it? Let that come out, and then it becomes a discussion between the whole group rather than it be a response to what other people think. And he was fascinated by this as to how you could create those opportunities that meant that students felt that their ideas could come out and be considered rather than trying to guess what are the ideas in other students or within the teachers' heads. And
I think the other point that Paul would make about efficiency.
Plan the activities that go with the problem that's there.
I think the other point that Paul would make about efficiency is how efficient is it if the approach that you're using is successful for 10% of the students in the group.
Yeah.
And so, yes, okay, it's efficient, but it's not effective. And so by surfacing these ideas, and I think Paul is also very well aware that even though when the pressure's on, many of us resort to telling, we know that telling doesn't work. We can actually tell the students this is the correct way to think about this physical phenomenon. We can tell students that adding tops and bottoms of fractions doesn't give you the right answer. But unless we deal with the fundamental ideas that produce those responses from the students, they're just going to be going back to those ideas in the future. So I think that Paul would say that the efficiency argument is just completely misplaced, because it's not effective. It's not very efficient if it's unsuccessful for such a great proportion of students, and particularly in the US. I don't know if you saw the latest data from The Economist, but something like 18% of American university students don't have the math capabilities of the average 10-year-old.
Mm.
That's like almost 1 in 5 college students can't match the average 10-year-old in math. And so the efficiency argument might have some more strength if what we were doing right now was actually effective, and it clearly isn't.
I would also say something I really appreciated about Paul that came through his work was he really understands the nature of science, and he understands the nature of mathematics. Yeah. And mathematics at its heart is about reasoning and finding patterns and understanding structure and patterns. And efficiency doesn't get into that conversation. It's what's really valuable mathematically is missed if we're trying to think about how efficient students are, because that isn't what maths is. Maths is really something different to that.
Laurie Buxton, who was Chief Inspector of Mathematics for the Inner London Education Authority in the 1980s, wrote a book called Do You Panic About Math? And in it, he suggested that there's probably nothing else in the world where the perception of the experts in the field differs more from the perception of the common person. So as Joe said earlier, people think that math, you have to be quick, you have to know these things. Professional mathematicians don't believe that at all. There's a complete misunderstanding of what mathematics is really all about. And so, most people are completely mystified when people talk about mathematics as a source of beauty, which is a consistent theme amongst professional mathematicians. But of course, if you think it's about getting the fastest answer to a narrow multiple choice question, you're never going to appreciate why that might be the case.
So, Joe, I'd like to follow up on some of the math kinds of things in efficiency, and I'm curious how your thinking comes up, or how you think about some of the things that I find to be really frustrating in this sort of conversation about what works in teaching and learning, right? As you might be aware, you're, at least on social media, you are somewhat controversial in math.
Really?
Yeah, you may have heard. And I have a lot of sympathy, and I think, cognitive science, or quote unquote, the science of learning, is really important. We talk about it in our work, and I think that we want to make sure that we're understanding and not dismissing those things out of hand. But and for example, I think it's silly that people would say we shouldn't have students memorize multiplication tables. How they do that would, there might be some varieties in there, which is a different conversation altogether from being able to be super fast with mathematics, Dylan, like you're talking about at a higher level, right? But one of the things that I struggle with in conversation is this sort of formulaic approach of you must build the knowledge first. And in fact, if you don't really do the explicit instruction first and foremost, you run the risk of students building misconceptions. And Chris, you were talking about some sort of collaborative dialogue, and I was thinking, boy, those folks might be thinking, oh, their students are going to have misconceptions that they're developing that would be very hard to sort of override, and you could run into trouble down the road. My personal, and I'm not a math teacher, and I do find a lot of the sort of science of learning, quote unquote, comes from a math perspective, math and science. I was social studies. I had, psychology and humanities, as Dylan articulated, there's some differences there that are really distinctions that make difference. So when I hear people say you must build that knowledge first, and then you might go do something that's more inquiry, I think that's a way to do it, but it's not the only way to do it. And while Dylan, you talked about, if only 10% are getting it, is it effective? I would say it also, is it durable? Is it something that they are, whether it's 10 or 90%, 10 years from now, are they using it? Is it something that is practical knowledge? So if you can talk a little bit about how you think about the sort of importance of knowledge and building knowledge, and then moving into something that's more, I guess, might be deeper learning. I'd appreciate that.
Well, I should say off the bat, the reason I'm controversial is because people see me pushing back on the tracking system in the US. And the people who really want students in different level groups from a very early age, try and discredit me because I push back on that. But mathematically, I mean, what I would say to people who are so strongly believing that students need the knowledge before they can learn conceptually is we have so many studies that have shown that students learn incredibly well when you give them rich tasks where they're having to think and problem solve. And within those tasks, teachers teach them formal mathematics. Their brains are sort of primed to learn them. I've seen this in teaching. I've studied it. I've read other studies where you get students excited about mathematics and they're interested and they need to know this formal mathematics to go forward in the problem they're doing. So, I mean, it's indisputable that students learn really well in that approach. So I don't know what to make of people saying, well, they have to have the knowledge before they can go on to think conceptually, because that's just not what I see in the evidence. Now, I know that the people who believe in that also are very narrow in the evidence they look at, and they don't look at this large body of work inside mathematics education. So I think that's part of the reason they're so committed to that idea. They haven't taken account of all the other evidence that's out there.
I think the other point that's really important, as Brown and Burton showed in their studies in the 1970s, students don't remember algorithms perfectly, and they need to repair these algorithms, certainly in mathematics. And if they have no understanding of why the tens and the units are in different columns, they're going to actually repair the bugs incorrectly. So I think that there's no doubt that the best way forward is for the skill to develop along with the understanding, because we never remember things perfectly, and we need to repair these buggy algorithms, and understanding what these things are doing is part of that. The other point I was going to make about Joe's perspective, I think, is really important. It's now becoming clear to me that we cannot teach our students everything they need to know for the rest of their lives by the age of 18. They're going to have to carry on learning to be successful. And if we extinguish the passion for learning that every 5-year-old has when they arrive in school, no matter how much we teach them by the age of 18, we failed them. So the evidence isn't a slam dunk either way, but even if it is the case that students using a more inquiry-based approach have lower levels of achievement on multiple choice tests at the age of 18, I'd be willing to trade that off if they are determined to carry on learning, believe they can learn, and have positive attitudes and are still curious. So it may be that there's a difference between short-term and long-term goals, but I think the long-term goals are increasingly important, especially as it becomes clearer that the future will belong to those who can evolve and adapt and learn to work with AI rather than just acquire a set of skills that they use for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, there was a Brookings Institute piece fairly recently, and I've cited it and I've written about it, and I'm planning on writing about it a bit more. And they talked about engagement, and they made 4 stages or 4 kinds of engagement. I'll get the first two wrong. One was resistor mode. You can imagine what that might be. But the last two was something like an achiever mode and an explorer mode. An achiever mode, somebody who's good at playing school and getting those answers and those kinds of things, which certainly has a place. And those students can often go on to do some good things. But the explorer mode is something that's a little bit more self-directed, more autonomous. And I think that distinction in my head is important in terms of, because it's almost like we're having two different conversations of the ways in which we think teaching should happen, that more formulaic kind of knowledge building than perhaps inquiry, being able to be good on multiple choice tests. That would be something more in the achievement mode. And that there are those of us who are really trying to build sort of explorers, right? People who are more self-activated, who are having metacognitive conversations with themselves and others and the teacher. But, of course, the way that it manifests in I'm hearing the sort of retort to Joe is, well, you want them to think conceptually, or one might say think critically. They can't do that without knowledge, which I think is not true. I think people can think critically without knowledge. They just can't think very well critically without knowledge. And so knowledge is helpful to get to deeper thinking, and that's important. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we formulaically should build knowledge first and then ask them to go do something with it. And to sort of bring it back to sort of the assessment piece is, how do we as teachers be perceptive and draw that out? But also, as we sort of alluded to originally or earlier, is how do we get students to be thinking about what they know, what they don't know, and what they need to know in order to develop that skill that will hopefully serve them as adults? Because at some point, to your point, Dylan, at some point as adults, we're going to need to be able to identify what we need to know and learn in order to figure things out, whether they're healthcare issues or buying a house or whatever those things might be. And there will be nobody there to give us the explicit instruction and the knowledge, or worst case scenario is there is somebody there and they'll give us really bad knowledge and we won't be able to sort of get through that. But again, that sort of idea of that they need the knowledge first, but before they can do any conceptual thinking, how would Paul maybe think about that, and how do any of you think about that?
I become really influenced by the work of a psychologist named David Daniel. And he's now at the National Science Foundation, but he's done a lot of work showing that a lot of the findings from cognitive science that hold true in laboratories just don't translate into classrooms. I mean, they're not just inapplicable, the results are the exact opposite way around. So I think this is the thing that Paul really understood. Very similar to the ideas of Lawrence Stenhouse back in the 1970s. Teachers have to figure out a way of making this work in their own classrooms. When teachers take on research, they're not just following instructions given by somebody else. They are creating new knowledge, albeit of a distinct and local kind. And I think Paul understood that better than anybody. And that's why we started out by saying, we don't know what this looks like in your classroom, because we're not in your classroom. We're not teaching your content. We don't know your students. And the idea that teachers have to become knowledge workers to apply scientific findings, I think, is resisted by a lot of science of learning folks, because they just say, well, just do more retrieval practice, do more practice testing. Well, there's very little evidence that that's the right way to approach most of what we want students to get better at in school. So I think it's just, if I had to summarize Paul's work in one word, it would be humility. An incredibly able person, but really humble about how much he could tell other people what to do. That's why he was, I worked with him on research projects. I also worked with him on committees, debating university policies. And I knew I'd said something stupid when he said, I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled by this, because it wasn't him being coy or clever. He actually would always assume that what you said was smart, and he just hadn't figured out why it was, and he would get you to think it through. But that humility, I think, is something that a lot of people in education could do with getting a bit more of, because we have teachers, we have millions of teachers around the world doing the best they can, trying to make the best sense of what the possible jobs they're being given to do in schools, with curricula that are far too full and demands that are completely unreasonable given the role of other factors on student achievement. And it's just that humility of saying, well, what can we do? We're not going to tell teachers what to do because we don't know what to say to them, but what we can do is help them figure it out a little bit more effectively and just do a slightly better job day in, day out.
That reminds me of something about Paul as well that was so wonderful. I remember when Paul came to work at Stanford for a while and was sort of in residence at Stanford, and how shocked the doctoral students were who worked with him. And they were all coming to me saying, oh my gosh, it's like he's really interested in our ideas. And that was a big change for them. I don't want to sound kind of anti my colleagues or anti-American, love my colleagues and this country, but it's not what they experienced. And I had that same reaction when I started working with Paul. When he became my PhD advisor, I was terrified. He was this guy who was like a knighted chair of big national committees. And I know he spent so much time in those early meetings with me, helping me feel that I had expertise and confidence. He would defer to me. He would ask me questions. He was so just curious about everything that I was sharing with him. And I totally agree with what Dylan was saying, just a really curious, humble person who wasn't there to tell you what to do and give you his knowledge, even though he had so much. He was always there to sort of learn along with people, and those people are rare. I mean, it was amazing to work with somebody like that.
Well, that it seems to be one of the ironies that I have at least discovered or uncovered. It seems like the folks who really are insistent that they know that this is the way that teaching and learning works, and there's a sort of formula, and the irony is that at least in my view, is that the work that we try to do, which is inquiry and curiosity and humility, and in fact, in our workshop last week or 2 weeks ago, somebody said, well, you're the expert in project-based learning. I said, no, I have expertise. I am very uncomfortable with being called the expert because that assumes I know all the answers, and by no means would I want you to think that. But the irony again is that those folks who seem to be more formulaic lack the sort of humility and characteristic traits that an inquiry kind of mindset, I think, sort of smuggles in some way. I am mindful of time, and I want to wrap this up, but I'm curious. We've talked a bit about one sort of edge of, if you want to think of a ledger, but especially with Mark's work, and Dylan, maybe you can talk a bit about this as well, is that the sort of idea of psychometrics and sort of traditional testing, there's some real value to the sort of quantitative data. What might people, and what might Paul say, and any of you might say, are things that people who are a bit more sympathetic to some of the conversation we've had, what are some pitfalls and things or some mistakes that we might be making or in danger of making in terms of assessment in a more sort of organic and authentic kind of mode, if that makes sense?
Well, I think that the work of Mark Wilson and his colleagues is interesting because they're not traditional psychometricians in the sense of people who want to stretch kids on a 0 to 100 scale and want to get more and more accurate placements of an individual. The work on progression, for example, is trying to figure out when a student's understanding of a particular scientific concept gets better, what is it that gets better? Why is that important? Because then you know what feedback to give. So what Mark is trying to do, I think, is to bring some psychometric precision to the kind of intuitive hierarchies that people may have in their heads, and say, actually, I know you think this is the right sequence to teach things in, but it may be better to actually teach them in a slightly different sequence. So I think Mark is unusual in that he is a psychometrician trying to think about formative assessment, how to improve instruction rather than trying to assess its results. And I think that's why Paul, I think, was interested. I don't think Paul was that interested in formal testing and examinations, except as social phenomena. I think he was interested in how can we make this either better or slightly less injurious to students? How can we have assessments that support learning rather than just give students a number or a grade?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, he was certainly influenced by Graham Nuttall in that sense, and Hidden Lives of Learners. And certainly when I was doing my PhD, it's one of the first books he got me to read when I said I was interested in what's assessment like in classrooms. He steered me away from looking at exam papers and how teachers dealt with that to looking at Graham Nuttall's work. And, this idea of, can we map learning and what does it mean? And the idea that, it was the kids who actually developed metacognitive skills who seemed to do better, not necessarily the ones who seemed bright at first or who people said were higher ability. It was those who were developing those skills, and how do we help them do that? So that was where his interests lie most of the time.
And I think that chimes in with Joe's work on particularly girls who want to understand what they're doing rather than just getting a high score.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to wrap us up. I want to give each of you an opportunity for some sort of final words and anything you want to say about Paul. Hopefully, I've done at least some sort of justice here in hosting this conversation. And again, I think it's just interesting, if nothing else, to note the sort of profound effect that Paul's work on assessment has had on teaching and learning, globally. And even if, my assumption is that many teachers may not know his name, but perhaps they should. If nothing else, though, and it sounds like his humility would say he would want them to know his work, perhaps more than his name. What do you think? We'll go around the horn, start with you, Chris, and Joe, and then Dylan, give you the last word. Is how do you sort of think about the sort of current state of education, and how did Paul, he didn't pass that long ago. What was his sort of take on the current state of education, and anything else that you think you would like to say here before we end this conversation?
Paul was always willing to look at what was going on and to say, right, this is what's going on at the moment, but how do we actually help children learn better? And how can we use assessment and help teachers do that? So, through his career, really, where he did lots of work with policy and that with various governments, and made recommendations, etc., in particular the way they dealt with the TGAT report and the levels. He was never bitter about anything, or never seemed to be bitter about anything, but he would always say, so this is where we're at. What can we do to try and help children learn better? And how can we help teachers with that? And so he was always very optimistic moving forward that things would get better. And they did. Things have got better over the 20, 30 years since Dylan did the original review. Teachers, I feel, do teach better today than they did 20 years ago when I was a teacher.
And do you feel like he was cognizant of that? Did he recognize his contribution to that?
He recognized he was part of that. Yes, I think he did. And he should do. He has left a profound legacy within assessment, within education.
Joe?
Yeah, just an incredible man. I feel so happy that I was able to learn from him so early in my career. And what I saw him doing, and what he did throughout his career, is center students in the process of learning and assessment. He believed in student capability. He believed in teachers he believed in teachers just as he believed in students, that teachers were able to shift how they thought about students and build on their thinking. And I just think he was just a beacon for all of us in pushing us to have that belief in students and have students be responsible for their own learning. I think his work has had a huge impact around the world. Chris, that book you put together, I think gave some indication of that. All these different authors around the world talking about how things have shifted in really significant ways. So I'm just very grateful to have known him and really happy to be able to continue what he taught me.
Okay, Dylan, give you the last word here.
I think, building on what Joe and Chris have already said, he had a profound influence. But I think the most profound influence of all is completely unappreciated by those who've been influenced by his work. So because Paul was such a kind of low-key character, his work has actually been profound because of the ways that other people have carried on these ideas. So I think the education of children around the world has been improved by people, for people who've never heard of Paul Black, because of the way that he worked, his low-key approach, his desire never to be in the limelight and always to give credit to other people where that was appropriate. I'm reminded of a quote that's often attributed to Winston Churchill, although I've never been able to find out whether he really said it. Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And, many of Paul's ideas were brilliant, but not picked up. So he was involved in the N and F proposals for changing A levels early on, recognizing the role of standard error. So he was saying we should have a 20-level scale, but we should report every student's grade plus or minus 2 points. The idea that it would have been a transformative approach to grading students at the end of secondary school. So the TGAT model was far ahead of its time until it was derailed by government policies. So it's that working behind the scenes, influencing people, getting people to think about issues in the right way. The influence is extraordinary, and most people aren't aware of it.
Well, and Dylan, I'd like to thank you for recommending that we broaden the conversation, and we're unfortunately Mark was unable to join us, but Chris and Joe, it was great to include you in this as well. We'll put some of the things that we talked about in the show notes, the books, and Dylan, I know you wrote a paper, actually several papers that have been published in reflection of Paul's work. So again, the profound nature of which he's influenced the way that we think about teaching and learning and assessment for learning should not go unmentioned and not go unnoticed. So hopefully, as I always say, hopefully this conversation was helpful.
Yeah, I'm really glad.
Thank you.
Thank you for suggesting it, Drew.
Yeah.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.